Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction and allowing us to present at your workshop. So as you might have garnered from the description, we're going to change focus a little bit to talk about dust emissions from mine sites. Before I get going, I just want to recognize my co-presenter, Michael Smith. He's a graduate student at St. Mary's University who is being co-supervised by myself and Dr. Linda Campbell. I am an environmental scientist at Natural Resources Canada based in Ottawa. So we wanted to provide you all with an overview of our recent work. Can I just make sure that you can see my main screen and not my presenter screen? You can see my main screen? Good, awesome, thanks. Yeah, so we wanted to provide an overview of our recent work where we were investigating the transport and fate of metal-bearing tailings dust into the environment from 2 abandoned mine sites in Nova Scotia. So one of the main drivers behind this project was climate change. In Canada, we know that climate change models are predicting increases in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, which would all impact the mining and metal sector. Primarily, these changes could lead to an increase in the occurrence of extreme weather events such as flooding and droughts, which will be a big challenge for mines when it comes to waste and water management. Specifically, we identified that these changes in temperature and precipitation would potentially result in increased dust emissions from mines, both active and abandoned. So we wanted to investigate the metals associated with these dust particles to better understand the fate and effect of dust in the surrounding environment. So we know that dust is a growing problem at mine sites. However, very little research has been conducted on the environmental side, but also very little research has been conducted on the metals associated with these dust particles. So we felt that it was really important for us to not only improve our understanding of dust in the surrounding environment, but also assess and develop tools to better monitor and manage dust generated from these mine sites. And this would provide guidance for not only the mines, but also risk evaluators as well. So a few years back, we had an opportunity to work at a number of abandoned mine sites in Nova Scotia. And the 2 that we'll be talking about today are Sterling Mine and Montague Mine. Michael's going to focus more on the Montague side, and I'll talk a little bit more about Sterling. So Sterling is an abandoned mine site. It's an old lead, zinc, copper mine located up in Cape Breton. It hasn't been active since the 50s, so there's been about 70 years of weathering of the tailings waste in that area. And Montague Mine is an abandoned gold mine located pretty much in Dartmouth, very close to Halifax. So, you know, as part of this project, we wanted to assess various different types of methods so we could measure the dust, we could investigate what's in the dust, and we could understand the potential environmental effects or the fate of metals that are associated with those dust particles. So we deployed a number of different methods to measure dust in and around these mine sites. So going from A, this is our high volume air sampler, which is primarily a vacuum pump that actively samples dust from the immediate area over a 12-hour period. We place it right in the middle of the tailings area, so we get a really good amount of dust sample where we can conduct geochemical and mineralogical analysis. Next to that in B are our passive air samplers, and we deploy these at various points around the mine site and further afield, upwind and downwind. And we deploy these for about 12 to 15 months. And we can go out and change the filters every 3 months. So this method is actually really beneficial because we not only understand the spatial patterns in dust coming from these mine sites, but we can also understand temporal changes. So if we're seeing changes, seasonal differences, for example, which is important when understanding risk. In C is a very simple rain catcher. So we can understand the contribution of dust associated with wet deposition. And this is important too, because we can understand the mobility or solubility of metals from those dust particles in these rain samples. We also sampled lichen. They've been shown numerous times to be a really useful biomonitoring tool for atmospheric pollution. Michael's going to talk more about lichen in his part, but so I'm not going to focus too much on it right now. In E are a picture of the tailings. These are large areas of waste that are left in these sites. We wanted to sample the tailings for geochemical and mineralogical characterization of the source, so we could then link that with what we were seeing in our dust samplers. And we're also able to assess the fate of the metal-bearing dust by conducting toxicity assessments in the lab with the tailings, as well as evaluating metal-bearing dust in surface water. So my colleague Amy there collecting water from an adjacent stream, and sediments collected from the stream, as well as wetland areas. In addition, we incorporated remote sensing and satellite imagery as a method for trying to understand the transport of dust in these environments. And this was in collaboration with the Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation, who are also part of Natural Resources Canada. You can see in the image at the bottom, this is Sterling Mine, and the large red area that's denoted by A is showing you the tailings impoundment area. So this is the large tailings waste that is located at this site. And what the satellite imagery was able to provide, not just this visual assessment of the tailings area, but also understand its transport downstream. So if you look to the map in the top right, this is just a map of the area and where we sampled at various points. ST4, which was a sediment sample we took, is adjacent to the site located D in that image. And what we found out was that the tailings from this site were being blown into the stream that runs adjacent to it, and you can see that in the picture, and then being taken downstream and deposited in this wetland area. So remote sensing was actually a really useful tool in identifying these areas of deposition and transport. So one of the objectives was to understand the metals associated with the dust. So the geochemical characterization of the tailings was undertaken. And so our approach was basically to sieve the tailings to less than 63 microns, which is used as a proxy for dust. So only these really small particles or size fraction would most likely be in suspension or be part of dust. And then what we did with that was basically digest it and then conduct an analysis on it to identify metals of concern that were associated with these dust particles. And so these are results from our Sterling tailing sample. And you can see in the figures that zinc, lead, copper, arsenic, antimony, and cadmium were all elevated relative to soil guidelines. Which was showing that these dust particles have high concentrations of metals associated with them, and that these metals are potentially being transported into the surrounding environment. But what we also need to understand, okay, these dust particles have metals that are elevated, but how are these metals interacting with their surrounding environment? So are they bioavailable or bioaccessible from these particles? So to understand that better, we also conducted mineralogical characterization of the tailings. And I'm not going to get into too much scientific detail here, but I do want to draw your attention to the results for lead. We found that 67% of lead is hosted in a secondary mineral called sericite. And this is really important because sericite is the most bioaccessible form of lead, and it was abundant at Sterling. So these advanced mineralogical techniques provide us with really important conclusions in terms of the potential for bioaccessibility and bioavailability in the environment, which leads us to the human health component. So one of the emerging areas of concern for us is the potential for human exposure to this tailings dust. We are primarily environmental scientists, not human health experts, but based on the mineralogy and geochemical results from Stirling, we felt the need to investigate human health exposure at this site. And obviously looking in the environment, so looking in downstream areas, looking at the lichen, there is a potential for human health exposure just through hunting and fishing. But there's also a potential for human exposure to these metals from dust through recreational use. And so I'm just showing you a picture from my colleague Mike Parsons' work at Goldenville, which is also another abandoned mine site north of Halifax, 2 hours north of Halifax. In his 2012 report, this is a photo of children playing in tailings waste. It looks like sand, but this tailings waste had high concentrations of arsenic in it, and it was being used for a 4x4 rally by the local residents. That's since been shut down due to the work that was conducted there to highlight the issues surrounding the contamination in this area. And on the flip side, on the other photo, this is the tailings impoundment area at Stirling. We've been there multiple times, and on a few of those occasions, we have come across people using ATVs, and you can see quite clearly ATV tracks being used on this, ATVs tracks on this tailings impoundment area, which shows that it's being regularly used for recreational use. Now on a dry, dusty, windy day, there is a high potential for inhalation as well as ingestion of these dust particles. So based on the work that we did identifying the metals of concern, we're now looking at bioaccessibility testing of these tailings to really understand metal release in simulated bodily fluids. So our first objective is to look at ingestion, so using gastric fluid. And then also we want to move on to look at inhalation of the dust particles so we can really understand the full spectrum of environmental and human health risk in these areas. So that's it from me. I'm going to pass it over to Michael, who's going to talk a little bit more about the work that he's been doing at Montague with the lichen. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. So hi, everyone. My name is Michael Smith. I'm a master's student at St. Mary's University. And like Carrie mentioned, we've also been using lichens as biomonitors of these legacy mine contaminants and dust. And my project mainly is to look at the spatial distribution of these contaminants around the sites. So lichens are a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus, and they obtain nutrients as well as contaminants from atmospheric deposition. So they are really good tools for monitoring the air quality. Next slide, please. So just some brief background about lichens. There's many different sources of elements to lichens, either as particulates or volatile species. They can be natural sources like volcanic emissions or anthropogenic sources such as that from industry. But in this case, we're looking at historic mine sites where there's tailing deposits that are can be a source of dust. Lichens can accumulate elements in 3 different ways generally. So there's particulate trapping, and that's when particulates just accumulate on the surface. Extracellular cation exchange is when cations can bind to ion exchange sites on the cell wall. And then there's intracellular accumulation, and that's when the elements move into the actual cells themselves. But that's a slower process. So because they can accumulate elements in different ways, this makes them really good tools for monitoring air quality and dust emissions. But also just to note at the bottom there, different species can also interact with lichens. So not only can they be used to monitor the air quality, but they can provide insight into how these contaminants are transferring to the terrestrial ecosystem. So invertebrates, for example, will use lichens as habitat. Birds will use them as nesting material. And in the winter, caribou will consume lichen as a large part of their diet. So there is a potential for these contaminants to transfer over to other species in other parts of the environment. Next slide, please. So for our study, we've been working at the Montague Gold District, which is located near Dartmouth. And it was pretty active in mining in the 18 and 1900s, and it was abandoned in the 1940s. So you can see there in gray is the main tailings deposit. And what we did was we set up these sampling grids around the tailings and in various directions. And the idea was to collect lichen samples at each of the intersection points. So we collected lichens at most of those red dots. And we collected two species of lichens, Usnea, which is also known as old man's beard, and Platysmatia lichen, which is also called rag lichen. And our idea was to measure the mercury and arsenic concentrations in them because these tailings deposits are elevated in them. Mercury because they would use mercury to extract the gold, and arsenic because these gold deposits are also hosted with arsenopyrite, which contains arsenic. But today I'll just talk about the mercury data because that's mostly what we have so far. Next slide, please. So when we measured the mercury concentrations in the lichens, I used interpolation and GIS to create these kind of heat maps, which basically allow us to predict concentrations in areas that we didn't sample. So this map is for Usnea lichen, and you can see the mercury range from about 69 to 320 micrograms per kilogram. And it was able to detect hotspots. So most hotspots were found either on the edge of the tailings or directly on the tailings. And that likely just reflects direct exposure to dust in the windblown tailings. And the highest concentrations were found north of the tailings, as you can see by those red areas, as well as down at Old Stamp Mill, where there is a small historic mining operation site where ore was crushed. Next slide, please. And then this map is for the other lichen type, Platysmatia, and it has the same color scale as the previous map. So as you can see by there's more green and yellow in this one. So this lichen wasn't able to accumulate as much mercury. It only ranged from 50 to 195 micrograms per kilogram. And this could be because these two lichens have different growth forms, different morphologies. So the Platysmatia lichen is more two-dimensional. It has an upper and lower surface, whereas Usnea is 3D. It's branching, so it has more surface area. So it's thought to intercept and come in contact with more mercury. But when you look at the spatial patterns, they still show similar to Usnea here. So the highest concentrations were still found north of the tailings, as well as at Old Stamp Mill. So this just indicates that collecting these two lichens together at these mine sites can help to confirm spatial trends that we're seeing of these contaminants. Next slide, please. What we also did was we grouped the data based on distance to the tailings. So this map, in this graph, there's the side for Platysmatia lichen and then Usnea lichen on the right. And then the data were grouped on if they were collected on the tailings, within 100 meters, within 200 meters, and so on. So as you can see, there is a general decreasing trend as you move farther away from the tailings. And in both lichens, highest concentrations were found directly on the tailings. And then for Platysmatia, the lowest concentrations were found at the farthest away, at greater than 300 meters away. But for Usnea, it was in the 200 to 300 meter distance range. And We also collected reference samples of these lichens from St. Mary's campus, just to provide some context of these values at Montague. So I have those plotted there with the red line. And you can see that most of the data points from Montague are above those lines, which suggests that the tailings and the dust that's coming from this tailings are likely elevating these concentrations of mercury in lichen. Next slide, please. And lastly, we also looked at where the lichens were collected and what type of sampling environment. So near roads, urban areas, wind throws, forests, bogs, and wetlands. And as you can see in this graph, on average, the mercury concentrations were highest in bog and wetland environments compared to the other sampling types. And this could be because of biogeochemical factors at the sites. So bog and wetland environments are typically oxygen limited. So there's higher rates of methylation and methyl mercury production. So these type of environments could be releasing and transporting mercury into the air and into the lichens, in addition to probably direct contamination from the tailings as well. And I think that's about it for my slide.
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, just for a conclusion, to wrap it up quickly, metals in lichen have, as Michael's pointed out, have shown to be a really good indicator of dust distribution. And they're really important for as a biomonitoring tool, for not only potential environmental impact, but also to understand the spatial distribution of this dust from human health concerns as well. We would highlight that there's a number of different analyses that need to be conducted on these dust particles to really understand the risk or the fate and potential effects. And mineralogy and geochemical analysis is really important. We need to know what's in there, but we also need to know how bioavailable or bioaccessible it is. And so the mineralogy piece really provided some important information for us. Work is ongoing at Montague. Michael is still working on his thesis, and I would refer you to Dr. Linda Campbell's work out of St. Mary's University under her Dynamic Environment and Ecosystem Health Research Group. They are doing a lot of work on this site. And just to note that bioaccessibility studies are underway, and we hope to provide more information with regards to that